continuing the conversation. So feel free to tweet about this event or on LinkedIn. There's, we think that this is going to be a really interesting program, and it'd be great to continue the dialogue beyond just today's session. And so here we are with today's session. And with that, I want to introduce Peter Van Emberg with CBRE. Peter serves as treasurer of the chapter, as I mentioned, and he's the senior managing director and regional client strategist in CBRE's management consulting group. Peter recently led the facilities integration related to CB's acquisition of Johnson Controls facilities outsourcing business last year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, and I want to thank him and thank all our sponsors too.
All right, as we get dialed up to get our partners in London and New York, which are at the back of the room. Moving the technology over. Great. Well, thank you, Al. And many special thanks to our AOL partners in London and New York for hosting this truly unique cross-regional education event. London, New York, can you hear us? Are we live?
Yeah.
We are live. All right. Terrific. So we're really excited to have this special event over lunch here in Washington and New York, and cocktails in London, which I think a lot of us in the room are probably a little jealous that we're not having happy hour with our colleagues in London right now. So today we're pleased to host three senior corporate real estate executives who will impart their insights on how to drive corporate real estate value during the mergers and acquisitions process. 2015 was a banner year for M&A activity. The Wall Street Journal predicts the torrid pace of M&A will continue in 2016. So what's exciting is we have three experienced senior real estate leaders, each representing very different industries and have very different experiences on how they have approached the M&A process. Some may be more from a cost-saving standpoint, others may be about increasing business or scale or protecting market share. So we really look forward to hearing each of their remarks in all three different regions, and then we'll turn it over to a Q&A that's truly global. So bear with us. This is kind of a new concept for us, and hopefully it will go smoothly. So think of your questions as we go along. So next slide. So this is just briefly the agenda. We have three panelists. We have Kevin Frankenberger in New York from Marsh & McLennan. We have Troy Humphreys from Pfizer in London. And here in Dulles, Virginia, we have Steve Dunn from the newly combined CRE company. Next slide. Our first presenter is Kevin Frankenberger of Marsh & McLennan Companies, a global professional services firm based in New York. Kevin currently leads the global real estate strategy and governance group, where he oversees M&A due diligence, workplace strategy, data integrity, technology, and lease administration. Marsh & McLennan was active in 2015, making various infill acquisitions throughout the year to strengthen service lines and build market share. So Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to New York. Why don't you kick things off by providing an overview of the M&A process from your perspective at Marsh & McLennan.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. So today at Marsh & McLennan Companies, most of you may know us from the subsidiary OpCos, which is Marsh, Guy Carpenter, Mercer, and Oliver Wyman. Other more common names, we're about 60,000 people who focus on risk and human capital and strategy consulting and professional services. But really talking a little bit about the real estate here. We have about 12 million square feet, which is about half here in North America and half spread around the globe, around 630 locations. We do a fair amount of M&A activity each and every year. We look at anywhere from 25 to 50 deals, and we've been able to create a good partnership with our corporate development groups as well as our business groups in that process. To help understand how we might manage that a little bit, we have a regional organization for real estate, which is very much focused on two large regions of the globe, as well as a business operations team, which I am part of. The reason we did that is because the M&A activity and the due diligence activity that goes along with that can often be very disruptive to the regular flow of activity that goes along with managing the portfolio, managing your clients and their expectations, because a lot of times the projects come up and says, hey, we're doing something next week. It's not one of those things that you can easily push off and push down the line. So that's kind of led us to this group of where we focus on M&A activity centrally and build those partnerships. On the next slide, what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to give you this best-in-class M&A process that we think somebody can follow from beginning to end and develop this nice flow chart on the next page here. But unfortunately, on the M&A side, you can't really do that. When we look at the transactions and the activity that we get involved in, no two M&A deals are exactly the same. It's either a single site acquisition, it's a multi-site acquisition. It's in a single country, it's in multiple countries. The structure of the acquisition from a legal perspective, whether you're buying the assets, whether you're buying the stock, whether this is a acquisition where the seller is going through a formal bid process with an investment banking group, changes the dynamics pretty dramatically because it changes the timelines, versus a company that you've had a long-standing business relationship with, where you have a period of exclusivity where you can kind of work through these deals on a more leisurely timeline. So on the next slide, what I do want to talk through is what we see as an M&A transaction framework. What are the typical areas within an M&A transaction that we get involved in, and what might some of those areas of focus be on that? On the next slide, going through it, opportunity identification is what we see as the very early work that our corporate development group works on. They start looking at potential acquisitions that might expand our business. They talk with our business leaders to see what is a strategic acquisition, or get approached by investment banking counterparts where there's a company who's looking to sell their business and they're looking to solicit various buyers, and we may be interested. But at this point, there's virtually no information available, and sometimes it's around being able to provide some guidance on the valuation of a company that says, hey, there's this opportunity here. We have a location, or we have multiple locations. What might the synergies be for that acquisition? We don't know what the company name is. We know none of the details. We have none of the lease documents. We don't know the expirations. It's maybe what's in a confidential information memorandum. It's really high-level stuff. And they'll ask you for an opportunity of what might that synergy be? What is that? And what a lot of people that we've encountered are really afraid of is giving any kind of guidance, right? I can't give you an estimate of what it is to close down that facility and reserve that facility because I need to understand what the lease terms are, I need to understand the market, I need to understand the condition of the building. But at the early parts of the transaction, in our view, that's interesting. But if you can't provide your internal corporate partners who are driving the deal some kind of meaningful guidance, they're just going to make up the assumptions themselves, right? We're working with internal people who are incredibly bright, talking from business deals, from health benefits to tax issues to legal issues, and they're looking for professional guidance from real estate. And all of us here have a real depth of knowledge around real estate where we can make some pretty high-level assumptions and give some guidance to that process. And the reality is, if I didn't say it, if you don't provide it, next time they have that same acquisition, that same portfolio, that same question, they're not going to call you. They're just going to make that assumption themselves, and then you'll be stuck down later in that process trying to back into the number of how in the world did they come up with $500,000 worth of savings? What were they thinking? So it's that, how do you provide that guidance? How do you give them that advice? You also have to give them, what did you base it on, right? What is that? What are those conditions that, hey, listen, I gave you this guess based on these assumptions. And then as we move on to the next page, on page 8, you get into the due diligence phase, right? If that transaction turned into something meaningful, hopefully you'll get access to a data room which will have some lease documents, have some information. And in some cases, the information is great. In some cases, it's not. But it's really, you need to focus on how do you mitigate those risks, right? What do you focus on? You can't eliminate all the risks in an M&A transactions. You have to look at the ones that have the most impact to the overall economics and then focus on those. I've encountered people who say, listen, we can't do an acquisition unless we do a site visit and a condition assessment, and we go see it, and we really dig into the details. And if it's a critical piece of infrastructure, perhaps that's the way to approach. If there is environmental issues or production issues, perhaps that's the way to deal. But in many cases, you don't always have the time or the luxury to do that. And knowing that a lot of these deals, at least on our side, end up with a nice letter at the end that says, thank you for your participation in the due diligence effort. Now please delete all emails, analyses, and everything else that you've ever done about it so that it never happened. You have to balance how much effort and company expense do you put forward looking at risks that may or may not ultimately drive the value at that point. Or what can you defer further into the process? Or what risks can you mitigate by having certain reps and warranties within your purchase agreements? So, for example, you might do an acquisition in Latin America. You're uncertain, is that suite, is that building, is that facility up to the national electric code of that country? Forget about your own standards, but did they actually build it to what the standards are of that country? Well, you could do a lot of detailed analysis and trying to figure that out, or you can, in the purchase contract, hold them liable that if it's not, it's their cost to remediate that work. So you've mitigated the risk, but you've avoided a whole lot of upfront work, both on a timeline basis and as a cost basis. And as you go through that, it's also really important to partner with the technology and the business operations team around what is the future direction for that site, what's their thinking, and can you, from a real estate professional, add some value into that process, into that thinking, and develop a better outcome of what the new location strategy is once you take all those different factors into account. On page 9, if the deal still keeps going forward, hopefully you start getting to, filling in the gaps of your information that you discovered in due diligence. You may start transitioning into the integration planning of what would this transition actually look like. And this is the point where you start, tightening up your assumptions, maybe going out to third parties that you made some sublease assumptions on your own that you're going to get 50 cents on the dollar. You may have the opportunity to go out to third parties and actually tighten up some of those assumptions and revise those models. But one of the things that's always important, that we find important to look at or consider, is your requests for information from the target are one of many, many requests that your company is putting to them. And in many acquisitions, the amount of people who are aware of the deal on the target side is often very, very limited. So when you're looking for the Third Amendment of, the Fifth Amendment of the lease, and you're searching for that Third Amendment or the addendum to something, you have to prioritize those thoughts of how much risk could that possibly be versus all the other requests that the company has, and perhaps the tax documents or the benefit plan documents might actually have a higher priority. But you can't lose sight of that, and you need to be able to communicate what is the potential risk of not having that, right? If you have a small office and you don't have a lease and that it's 10 people, what is the potential risk of not having reviewed that prior to closing? And in many cases, the answer might be, listen, it's an acceptable risk that we're going to do, and we're going to sort it out, and even if those 25 people don't have a valid lease or some conditions around it, within the overall economics of the lease, we'll sort it out there. With that, you get to the integration, and then it's really where in many cases, the rubber hits the road. Now it's how do you combine these companies, or how do you integrate their portfolio into yours? And here it's really the importance is go back to the beginning where you made your initial projections, your initial assumptions from the first meeting of, hey, what do we do with this site, or what do we do with these collection of sites? How does it look to our portfolio? And to learn what worked, what didn't, what communications, what assumptions really panned out. And after doing this for a while, you start to develop, what are those critical things that you might have missed? How do you not do that same thing on the next transaction, and how do you mitigate those risks a little bit better? So after having done this for the last 8 years, anywhere from 25 to 50 deals a year, we've managed to get a good seat at the table of our business, find a way to add value. And on the last page here, on page 11, just some few things that we think are important to get a seat at that table and add value. It's understanding how an M&A deal is actually structured, how it relates to real estate. being able to provide meaningful information and guidance with really limited information. And the expertise that you have in real estate, while you're dealing with really smart people, can give them good guidance on how to work that, even if you are really uncomfortable making those assumptions on very limited information. You need to be a real estate generalist, being able to confidently talk about all aspects of the deal, not just the leasing, not just the construction, but you'll hit situations that says, hey, we're buying a business line of a large entity. They have half a floor. Well, you can't go in and always do a full engineering assessment. You have to be able to provide what are the risks around doing that acquisition, what are the unknowns that we might need to encounter, and how do we mutually kind of develop that into the language. I said before, it's really around risk mitigation. It's not, you can't eliminate all risks, but you need to be able to quantify the risks that you couldn't dig into and give them a sense of what is that risk. We've done deals where we've planned on sublease assumptions panning out, but saw clauses in the lease that gave ambiguity about our actual ability to market that space, and ended up being a $10 million question of, if we do this acquisition, we might be stuck with an asset that has the potential of a $10 million recovery, depending on that language. What's the appetite for someone to actually go search through that in the acquisition process? You need to be able to talk about real estate in business terms, not just real estate jargon. It's not about, how many square feet per person is this. It's around, hey, listen, we see a building that looks like it has a lot of vacancy. This could be the potential of a reserve. They have a very high square foot per seat. This is what it might mean. Maybe they have a lot of contractors in there. It's the partnership with technology and the business groups and staying in sync so that everyone's really on the same page. It doesn't make sense for technology to put infrastructure into a facility to get them onto the network if you're moving out 6 months later. Perhaps there's a better plan to avoid spending $50,000 or $100,000 to get a site online, but everyone needs to be connected. And lastly, it's really about connecting all those learnings from doing a deal, doing a transaction, and how can you reapply those to the next deal and the next transaction to make it a little bit better. So I know I went through some of that relatively quickly. Happy to answer questions as we go through, but with that, I'll turn it back over to
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. That was great. Really appreciated the M&A kind of transaction framework from your perspective, and certainly some of your key insights on how to get that proverbial seat at the table. Now I'd like to go across the pond and introduce our next panelist, Troy Humphreys. Troy is director in Pfizer's Mergers, Acquisition, and Divestitures Group, where he is responsible for providing real estate solutions to align and meet corporate business objectives in the EMEA and APAC regions as a part of the global integration team. Pfizer has certainly been active in the M&A front, most recently announcing the acquisition of Allergan for $160 billion, which is slated to close later this year, which would make Pfizer the world's largest drug maker by revenue. Troy, we're happy to have you join us. Welcome.
Good evening over there. Well, good evening here and good afternoon over there. We go on to the next slide. Just present some figures. As you alluded to, Peter, Pfizer, largest pharmaceutical company by sales. Some of you will recognise some of our products. Lipitor, Advil, you'll probably recognise in the US. Viagra, I think everybody will recognise that, the most counterfeited drug in the world. We've been pretty active in the mergers and acquisitions market. $250 billion, if you include the recent Hospira acquisition last year. We've added lots of square foot to the portfolio. Wyeth was 28 million square feet. Hospira, another 14 million square feet. So real estate has a lot to play in this arena in terms of how you then restructure that portfolio, what you're going to keep and what you may dispose of. If we go on to the next slide. So as you alluded to, pharma is a big player in M&A. There's lots of consolidation going on. Teva and Allergan. So Allergan are going to divest part of their business for $40 billion to Teva. That's post the Pfizer acquisition. Shire to combine with Blackster, $32 billion. And then as you can see, over the last sort of 15 years, the amounts are ever increasing. 2015, getting up to 70 billion, with another $118 billion pending, and that's exclusive of Pfizer's potential acquisition. So if we want to move to the next slide. So what I'd like to kind of touch on is just be aware of what type of deal that is going down here, because there's a lot to be said when the CFO or the CEO gets up and makes his press announcement, and the wording will be quite subtle in terms of how that deal is going to go forward. So acquisitions and mergers, and if you're acquiring a company, you could be the aggressor. And depending on how much he's going to pay for this company will depend on what type of synergy is going to come out of the deal. So if it's quite friendly and amicable, then you could be on the hook for lower values. If he's paying over the odds, then he's going to want more out of it than perhaps you're prepared to kind of give. In terms of an integration, you bring in two together. So essentially you may have different products in different locations. You still may get some synergies about bringing them together, but it's much more friendly and you're going to be retaining people. And then divestment is kind of akin to a divorce, really. You kind of work with these people for a long period of time, and you work with them through the divestment, and then all of a sudden this network that you have is kind of gone. And through all of these, really people play a big part in any M&A work or divestiture work. You have to work with people, and from my experience, people are generally very professional in the way that they conduct themselves, whether they're on either side of the table, even though they know they may be losing their job. People invariably act quite professionally and are quite supportive and helpful. But you have to kind of recognise that when you're working with them, they, in their head, may not be in a good place, but they'll always try and do their best. So the Allergan deal is talking about a combination of companies. So that's kind of a friendly sort of takeover, as much as they can be. But so I guess what I'm saying here is, you can kind of look these words up, but the English language is a great language for being very sensitive for words, and people will play tunes on the words. So just kind of try and understand what type of deal it is. So we go on to the next slide. So like Kevin was talking about, we have a process. We have an understanding phase. We're trying to assimilate information. You may not get all the information that you want. You try and work on an 80-20 rule. What's key for you? What's the big sites? Where's the greatest synergy going to be? Where are you located that's near to where they're located? But clearly there's opportunity here. And I think that's one of the key things for real estate and facilities. There's big opportunities here. If you're banging your head against the wall and you want to implement something, then quite often these big manoeuvres will allow you or enable you to kind of move on with those, because people are much more susceptible to change during this process. So take it on board that there's a big opportunity to kind of do something different. If you've got cubed offices and you want to move to open plan, you can drive the change here because you can consolidate. Then mapping the future end state. You've got some information. As Kevin alluded to, you won't get everything, but you've got some information. You can search the internet and get some information, and then as the deal goes forward, you'll have a clearing room where information that's been cleared by the legal parties will kind of drop it into it following your request. And slowly you'll kind of build that portfolio of information that allows you to then come up with whatever your strategy will be going forward. Invariably, the CFO is going to want to talk in numbers and cost. So, again, you need to kind of put it into his terminology. Don't talk to him about how many square feet you're going to take out or how many square foot per person. Talk to him in terms of dollars, in things that he can understand, and how you're going to reduce his bottom line and add to his P&L. Monetization is a great way of kind of getting his attention, because that's kind of free cash in some respects, and it goes straight to the P&L. As you're moving into the planning, you're further refining and developing your plans. You're working with the other enabling functions, with the business groups, to make sure that everything hangs together. Certainly if this is a global project, then you're invariably working in a matrix, you're working in different regions, but essentially it all has to come up into one composite, clear strategy. And what we have essentially is various submissions through each of these phases. So we'll have a very early submission in terms of what we think our initial synergies might be, what our initial plans are. We'll further refine that through submission 2 to make sure we're heading in the right direction and we haven't got any sort of wayward problems or challenges. And then this is kind of getting fed back up to the sort of the leadership team. So bearing in mind who the audience is going to be when you're putting these strategies together. As you then move forward, plan, you're then into execution. Start to think about post day one. What's it going to look like for people? Clearly, before that, you can't tell the whole business what's going on. It's a select group of people that are involved in this. But start to prepare a communications plan in terms of how real estate and policies and procedures are going to affect them from day one. So what we have is a playbook. Each business unit, each enabling function puts together a manual, if you like. That then gets linked together, and then on day one, that gets issued to the country managers. And then country managers can then disseminate that within their, we have sort of colleague management forums or local coordination councils, seem to change every time we do a deal. Somebody wants to come up with new acronyms for the whole process, but essentially they mean the same thing. So that manual gets issued, then everybody should be on a similar page because it gets issued to both sides. It doesn't necessarily talk about strategy, but just talks about process and policies and how you're going to operate going forward. Because no two companies have the same ways of working. So invariably, what we find is that their financial systems are completely different to ours. From point of view with Hospira, for example, the business owned all of the budgets around facilities and real estate, whereas within Pfizer, we own the real estate and facilities own the budgets. We pay all the bills on rent, we pay all the bills on cleaning and maintenance. So in that deal, it's quite difficult to actually get the financial information from Hospira because they just don't report it that way. So we had to come up with a template that would then allow them to kind of think about how we pull information together, which then ultimately becomes our budget as we kind of go forward. And then we'll have a year of discovery post day one of trying to refine those budgets. As you move on beyond execution, you're into tracking. You'll get more information because the clearing room goes. You can talk to your counterparts directly in any market, in any country. You start to work out their network and how it works. And you can then ask for that addendum 5, as kind of Kevin was talking about, and you can really drill down. Again, not every company is going to hold real estate information the same. We've spent many years building a big database to kind of hold all of our real estate information, but we find it's very patchy in other companies. Hospira actually had a really good database that we could pull on, but their finances were completely different. So on one hand, plus, on the other hand, quite a big negative, and we spent quite a lot of time working around that. So if we go on to the next slide. So for me, it's just some simple questions. I mean, I've got 17 up there, but just picking out a few. Just what's the CFO's synergy? What's his kind of target? Now, he'll say one thing to the street, and then internally he'll want a much bigger number, especially if he feels he's paid over the odds for this. And invariably, that number's going to be significantly different. So you've got to find that difference. And you may go in thinking, I've got to save X million, but on day one, you'll find that it's going to be much higher than that. Clearly, data is important. Headcount information is very key. Real estate data, also key. Headcount always becomes the bane of my life because it just means so many different things to different people. So BT are just interested in how many people are connecting to the network. So if you've got a big field force, you're not interested in those because they don't take up seats in offices. HR are only interested in FTEs. They're not interested in contractors because they don't really track them. And ultimately, we're interested in bums on seats, which is kind of somewhere in the middle of all of that. So when you're asking for your data request, just be clear about what you're asking for, because again, as Kevin said, these people on the other side of the table are going to be confronted with hundreds and hundreds of questions from different departments, and to get yours to the top, you have to be quite concise with how you're asking it, and you have to prioritize it. So don't ask them for that Fifth Amendment, because you probably won't get it. But you can get the key information from them, and and the head count depends on how well they kind of track that head count. Early questions from the business. Quite often, as you head towards day one or into day one, real estate is normally front and centre here, because the first question they kind of ask for out of the blocks is, where am I going to sit? And that seems to be on everybody's mind. Okay, we've done this deal, day one's going to happen, where am I going to sit? Especially if they know that there's another office around the corner and you're kind of co-located, and they know what sort of space you have and what your conditions are. So, so you can kind of help the business to kind of move forward very, very quickly. We've kind of done different plays in terms of, where we're going to sit. It's like we try and put recommendations forward rather than this is what it's going to be, because there'll be other challenges around why that location may or may not be good. So recommendations, proposals, certainly as you move further out from, that's okay if it's in 15 miles of your office, if you like. As you move further out, then you may want to move those below the line, and that becomes a further opportunity for you to then investigate, post day 1, post day 30. It's key to align with other enabling functions. Certainly, BT is key for us. They'll be working very hard to bring the two IT systems together. So sometimes they'll kind of put the real estate to one side, because they've got to create a gateway for the other party to kind of connect into the networks, to create new email accounts for all of those people. But it's an enabler for you to actually move. You can't just effectively pick up 50 people from one office, move them into your office, because they won't have any connectivity, because they need to connect back to their network. Another key one for us is around legal and safety regulatory, because most pharma companies are only going to have 1 or 2 offices in any one country, so they'll make that their registered address, which means they can't just move that at a drop of a hat. They'll need 6 to 12 months to move that address. So you may have a lease renewal coming up on day 1, but you can't move because legal have got a registered address there. So you may have to extend them. In the UK, they want 10-year leases. Well, clearly you don't want that if you're going to consolidate, so you're into a negotiation. Other markets are more flexible, and you can get 3 months' notice out of them. Communications, communicate. People are in, a state of flux. Anxieties are high. So the more you can tell people and the more you can put those fears to bed, the better. So as soon as you're able to tell them about plans around consolidating or moving, it's just one less thing for them to worry about, because they're going to have an awful lot on their mind, both sides of the table, that is. So next slide, please. So just remember, significant, I'm obviously getting up on my time now. So significant events is a good opportunity to drive change. So if you've got those things that you've been trying to do for years, do it now. Do it when you do the acquisition. Good data is imperative. You're not going to get everything, so ultimately you're going to work on an 80-20 rule. Communications, avoid surprises to people. People don't like surprisings, least of all the CFO. Alignment with other functions. Make sure that you're not getting out of an office before anybody else can actually do their work. Payback. If you're going to get out of an office, make sure it pays back. There's no point in getting out of somewhere if it's going to cost you 20 million to get out of it and you're going to save 2. The CFO is just going to shoot you. So you've got to work out what your ROI is on it, and just work through that. Real estate rationalisation is very visible. When you exit anywhere, in large communities or in small communities, you may be the largest employer in that community. It's going to be very visible. It's going to be in the news. It's going to be detrimental if you're closing a site and lots of people are employed there. So it becomes front and centre for a lot of those things, because it affects so many people. And then timeliness. Stick to your plans, avoid the surprises, and achieve the synergies, and de-risk it. Next. I think we're handing over to Stephen, Peter.
That's right. Thank you so much, Troy. Here in Dulles, our last esteemed panelist is Steve Dunn. Steve currently serves as the Director of Workplace Environments for CSRA, which recently came about through the merger of the defense contractors CSC and SRA, which you'll learn more about. And while we heard Kevin and Troy discuss their M&A experiences and lessons learned, Steve is truly living the pain of a post-merger integration today. So he'll be highlighting one of the summer blockbuster deals to hit the DC area in 2015, and first of several to come even as soon as this week. So Steve, thank you for taking time to chat with us today.
So, Peter, thank you so much. I truly enjoyed the presentations before this one. They were obviously larger scale than what I'm living through right now, but it's exactly the same process. The difference is the deal, not the process. The process, we went through exactly the same phases in our recent merger, and the results are vary in each of those phases. So, next slide. So let me tell you a little bit about the deal and how we've sort of designed this, and then I'll get into some of the details. So CSC had 72,000 employees around the world, 12.5 million square foot portfolio, 433 locations around the world. They, last summer, late spring, I guess, decided they were going to split their business into a federal contracting group and a commercial group. So they sort of started into that process. In the middle of that, they said, you know, it'd be great if we merged with SRA. So while that was all going on, they were in the middle of splitting themselves. They acquired or merged with SRA, and we had an additional 5,600 employees and about 750,000 square feet. So as they were sort of pulling themselves apart, we were trying to sort of put it back together to make CSRA. So it was quite a tumultuous fall for everybody involved. The result, anyway, is we have about 19,000 employees now and 3.5 or 4 million square feet, over 143 locations. Most of that is here in the U.S., and most of that is leased. We have a few owned locations, but only 3 or 4 to that end. We do everything that you would expect to see out of a real estate and facilities management group, travel, fleet, design, construction, critical environments, and so forth. Next slide. So I think that the key thing, SRA, I was legacy SRA. We had done 10 or 11 mergers over 10 or 11 years, and they were all much different scale than this was, and it had gone pretty smooth and everything was fine, and then this happened, and then the world completely changed for me and I think everybody involved. We had this much larger entity at CSC and a much smaller entity at SRA, and we sort of put the two together and pulled them apart and ended up with something in the middle. So the processes that we had that sort of made sense and the processes that they had and made sense didn't really align with the new company, because we're somewhere in the middle between that. So we've had the opportunity, as Troy mentioned, to do some things that maybe both groups have thought about. So we're rethinking many processes and procedures, as well as the real estate and everything else about the business. So it's a very busy time at CSRA. So I think first and foremost, what I came out of this was you have to help them make it happen. There's people with C's in their titles that have decided this deal is going to happen, and real estate and facilities is here to support that deal. It's not, we're a gate, and our due diligence and all of that process is vital, and it informs the deal, and we were certainly included in all of that process. But at the end of the day, what you totally got was the deal's going to happen. How can you support it? And that's really what we did. The other thing I would say about due diligence and so forth is, we had IMOs and PMOs and CMOs, and I've been to a lot of Mo meetings in the last 6 months, and all of those have been great and valuable exercises. But you have to understand the scale of each of that interaction and the scale that you end up at the end. So, through the IMOs and the CMOs and so forth, there was a lot of talk at 100,000 feet about synergies and culture and all those sorts of things. But as everybody said, as you get, the deal closes and you start working the deal, then you've got that, 10,000 feet in Boston. You've got to move to Arlington. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. And you haven't dealt with it at that scale enough. Nobody could have. There's millions, if not billions, of dollars in play, and everything's been structured around those sorts of numbers. And now you've got 40 people you got to move, and the deal, the nuances of that deal might change, and you have to be a little bit flexible. So, one of the things that happens, and you heard this from the other guys, is real estate helps through synergies and other things, helps drive that debt reduction. There's a lot of debt attached to every one of these deals, and there's a lot of CFOs and people like that looking for ways to sort of continue to chip away at that debt. So real estate has to contribute that both from a personnel and a facility standpoint. And the synergies list that we continue to work through are vital to help drive that debt. We were given, I shouldn't say given, we were given targets. We developed around 50 targets out of the portfolio that were possibilities. What I would say about those targets is we had some outside consultants that helped us through the process, and we continued to interact with them and develop targets. And we developed a number that seemed like it made sense, and a plan how we're going to affect these facilities over the next year. And everything's fine, and we go to a couple more Mo meetings, and they come back and say, hey, could you get us 20% more? So we go through that process, and we take another week, and we study, and we develop, and we come back and we say, yeah, we can get you 20 more percent. Here's how we would do it. You go through a couple more weeks, maybe another 20%. So you go through that, and then we get to within days of the closer. And I should say that we're not 60 days post close now, so I'm barely into the integration process as far as that goes. They came to me 2 days before we were going to close, and they said, we really need you to quadruple your synergy targets, and we'd like you to achieve it in 60 days. And that's when I said, you're out of your mind. You can't do it. And they said, well, look at it anyway. So we went back in one evening, and a bunch of us got together and showed them what that would look like. And it was more cost than the value to do it. I mean, we would literally break the company. And finally they said, okay, I understand. And we went back to the target we were at. But you had to sort of go through that process, and they kept pushing until finally you said, no mas. And finally they backed off, and we went back to a target that we think made more sense. Somebody mentioned communication. It's absolutely vital. There's a void in this. There's so many meetings and so much going on, but at the same time there's an incredible void, and you can't communicate enough. I've learned that over and over and over again. In that void, people make up stories, and they're all bad. So what you have to do is keep telling them that this is what we're doing. It's going to be okay. We're going to work through this. It's going to happen on this schedule, and that helps everyone through the process. But the void is where you don't want to go. Lots of things happen. Lots of surprises. Troy, I think, mentions that surprises are bad, but and they are, but they're still going to happen. And you've got to just take that surprise and try to be as calm as you can about it and deal with it. Despite all the due diligence you had, I got an $11 million change order 2 days post-close for a project we were working on. And it's like, man, you thought you probably knew about that last week, but you didn't mention it to me, right? Be calm. Try to keep everybody around you calm. It's hard, but it's vital. It's really important to engage the end users, all of your consultants, all your vendors. Try to understand as much as you can about the process that you're joining and the process you've come from, and try to get everybody involved in that process of how to make the best solution going forward for the new organization. So many people out there think we're doing it the right way now, and that's the way it's always been, and that's the way we're going to do it. And it's an opportunity to rethink the process and try to cast that net as wide as you possibly can to understand what those options are. Again, from outside vendors as well as people within the organization. That void is an opportunity to be a leader too. That void. There's so many places where there's not a policy or there's not a procedure. And if you say, I think we ought to do it like this, an awful lot of people say, yeah, that seems to work. And you sort of set that tone. So if you sort of become that leader, I think it raises your boat within the organization, and it gets the organization off on the right foot. And I think that's vital. Be attuned to real estate's impact on the culture. Everybody, again, is used to sitting a certain way or acting a certain way or dealing with costs a certain way. And if you come to it with an open, honest approach to it and try to make sure people know that you're thinking thoughtful about what you're doing, that comforts them. And there is lots of change going on across the business. But if you're, again, open and honest and clear about that, I think you can comfort everybody around that and create the kind of moving forward. Execute. So, what I want to say about this is, again, you got to be thoughtful. You got to be quick. There's deadlines around these synergies goals. I think Troy mentioned, you got to stick to the plan. At the same time, you got to be a little bit flexible. There's those 40 people in Boston that got to move, and when you get boots on the ground there, the rubber meets the road, you find out that there's actually a connection there from a customer that it's going to take 60 days to move. Allow that to happen. Don't try to pound that square peg through that round hole. Tell everybody you're going to be 30 days later. Make it happen. Keep moving. Ultimately, what you've got to do is you've got to hit. In our case, it was 1 month, 122 days, which was our goal to the end of the fiscal year, and then 1 year goals. And as long as you get to that target, there's a little flexibility between this month or next month. As long as you sort of hit those marks, you can't get too stressed about that connection that you didn't know about in time. Be patient. The other side of the table is not the evil empire. I found the other side of the table to be terrific. And as I think Troy again said, that everyone's trying to act in a very stressful situation the most professional way they can. You reach out to them, try to keep those lines of communication open. Be patient, be thoughtful. It's fine. Finally, I think real estate and design and construction today is an agent of change. And we've put a tremendous amount of effort into change management. I happen to think change management is nearly as important as the deal and the design as far as that goes to sort of making a project successful. And I've always advocated that change is good. But what I've completely heard and felt through this process is it's also hard. And you have to be sensitive to how hard it is and be respectful of that situation as well.
So now I'd like to turn it over to our Q&A portion of the discussion. We're going to go in reverse order. First, we'll call on any questions we have in this room here, and then we will turn it to our colleagues, any questions in London, New York, etc. And just as a reminder to the panelists in London and New York, when you get your question in the room, just restate it so everyone can have a chance to hear what the question is, and allow perhaps the other panelists to chime in with the answer as well. So any takers here in Dulles for a question to kick things off? Sure. John.
So, John Vivadelli with AfriQuest. There's a guy named Rahm Emanuel who says, kind of has the saying, I'll paraphrase a little bit, never let a good kind of a disaster go unused or unutilized. What are some of the things, one of the comments I saw was maybe take a look at new alternative workplace strategies and use this change as a way of going about doing that. Out of all of the different transactions, are any of you doing that? Breaking the one-to-one relationship and seeing ways of gaining synergies. I think that's another word that I didn't quite understand. A synergy target, maybe you could give me another word for that. Is that a politically correct term for something else?
Two questions I heard. One was around, do the panelists have experience using the M&A experience to drive
A change, yeah, a workplace change, yep.
Exactly. And the second question was, what really is synergy?
What is a synergy target?
And I think that's an important question because it can really have different nuances. Steve, you want to first stab?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at both of those. So a synergy is you get these lists of hundreds of locations, and you find out that there's 2 offices in Atlanta from each opposing group that are 2 blocks away from each other or 2 miles away from each other. And so what you try to figure out is, can you put them together and try to save on your real estate costs through that process. So that's the
Some sort of a consolidation or a movement away from one and replaced with another or whatever.
Yeah, and it's it might be one into another, or it might be put the 2 together in someplace down the street.
Yep.
To try to sort of limit that portfolio, and that happens with people as well. So, and then the second question was
Around workplace. Are you doing
Breaking the one-to-one.
Yeah, absolutely. So oddly enough, we are using that opportunity, but it's a funny condition. CSC had a corporate standard that was very consistent across the business, and so an office in Washington or an office in Los Angeles or an office in someplace else look very much the same. And what we're trying to do is actually not do that. We're looking really hard, frankly, from an SA point of view. We believe that people that do different things should sit in different ways. So we're trying to sort of break that standard, and so we've got people that are hoteling at significant ratios, and we've got people that are one-to-one. Again, based on what they do, and the workstation size and workstation standards change, again, based on the business that they're in and what they do.
Kevin, in New York, do you have kind of an experience around driving workplace change during the M&A process?
So I think there's a lot of changes that happen when you bring companies together from a design perspective and from a standards perspective, and certainly you always try to optimize that as far as you can. Question sounded specific around breaking the one-to-one ratio, and while we have some sites in Europe and a large 1,000-person site going up in Sydney that will break that one-to-one ratio, it's not part of our DNA yet, so we haven't hit that as much in the acquisitions, but it's certainly one thing that is very important is we've done smaller acquisitions of companies who've worked much more in flexible ways. So how do we support their existing work styles in a firm that might not have done that yet, right? So that's really where we are.
Great. Troy, are there any questions for you in London, or did you want to take a quick stab at that question?
Yeah, I mean, just taking a stab at that. I mean, in terms of workplace, invariably the businesses want to get together very quickly. So bringing one office into another office, if you've got a standard cellular office, then quite often you can't just bring those people in. So, by driving and changing the workplace, then you can bring the two organisations together. And you can then use restructuring funding to enable that. So you're not necessarily taking out of your BAU capital or your BAU expense. You can use restructuring funding, which gets a different treatment, certainly the expense side, to then enable that change to happen. So any office that may be, looking a bit tired, you can then bring the other organisation in, you can densify your space, you can do that off the back of closing the other. So you get your synergy by closing one, synergy by consolidating, and you enable the business to get together. So it's kind of a win-win, really. But we don't have a policy on it. We very much work from an influencing standpoint. So we have to kind of convince the business that these new ways of working, whatever they might be, are in their interest. But on the basis that they want to get the businesses together, they're kind of halfway there already.
Great. And Troy, do you want to take a question there in London?
Anybody like to ask a question? Don't all rush.
We heard a little bit more about continuous improvement. Sorry, it's Dominic from Wakefield. We talked a little bit about lessons learned and continuous improvement. So could you just expand a little bit on the process by which you understand where things have gone wrong and how you can correct them for the next process and how you feed that back in on a continuous loop?
Yeah, so it kind of comes from two sides. We'll look at what the other company do versus what we do and whether there's any better ways of doing things, and we'll kind of take that forward. We'll also do an internal look at how we do things. I guess the Hospira one was quite interesting in terms of budget. They manage their budget in a very different way to the way that we manage it, and so the lesson there was actually, I was under the impression that our finance were going to do this great job for us in terms of getting all of these budgets from the opposing company, and they were going to break them all down and they were going to put them all into the countries, and I was going to get handed a budget. That didn't happen. So what happened was, inadvertently, I went out to the businesses to ask them what their facilities costs were, and they gave me a very high level view based on the template that I provided them with for what their cost structure was in our terms, so that I could then work out what our synergies would be for doing whatever manoeuvre it was. The process kind of moved on, and I'm kind of sitting there quite happy thinking, well, I've kind of tested the water, I know their number. Later on in the process, the finance said, oh, you've given us a number. You can use that number for your year going forward. At that point, it's like, well, hang on a minute. I've not actually drilled into these numbers. I've just taken them on face value on the basis that you were going to kind of do some legwork around this. Oh, no. We've just taken it from the New York perspective. We know in EMEA and APAC it's going to be X millions, roughly, based on our consultants' sort of percentages of what real estate costs, which may not bear any resemblance to the way that we manage facilities. And your number kind of looks about right. That isn't broken down into the sort of 50 different countries that we kind of manage. So we ended up getting lumped with a number that we actually gave them. And then what we found is we were actually somewhere around about 20% out on the number. That once we actually did some further work, we're about 20% out on the number that we provided. So next time around, I'm going to be a bit more diligent about asking that question around finances, because I'll probably get lumbered with those numbers going forward. When you're talking about, I think the facilities budget on Hospira was about 50 million. So 10-20% becomes a big number. And then what you then got to look at is you then go back to your playbooks and you're then looking for further synergies, because they're basically going to hold you to a number. So any number you give someone, they're going to remember it. They're not going to remember the little box you've got at the bottom that says the caveats to this are X, Y, Z. They're going to remember that. So, be mindful of what you do. So, under promise, over deliver. That's kind of what we do.
That's right.
Being reasonable without kind of saying, oh, well, we'll give you 10, but you really know it's going to be 20. We might say we'll give you 18, thinking we've got a bit of headroom in there, but so under deliver, under promise, over deliver.
Cheryl, is it okay if we get a couple more questions in?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. Kevin, let's turn it over to New York.
Any questions here?
I have a question. Actually, I have a question for you, Kevin, about were you able to use any best practices from the risk management side of your company when you did your real estate risk management? Because I know sometimes when you're working with the front office, we did it at HP, we could use the same technique that sales did for due diligence when we did our real estate due diligence. So I'm just curious if you had experience doing that.
Yeah. So the question was, did we use any of our consulting that we might provide to clients, and we use the same client-facing consultants to assist internal processes and risk reviews? And the answer is yes. There's some conversation we have, as in many companies, sometimes the back office functions and the front office functions are separated a little bit. So we actually did go through the process of engaging those groups to help us internally to kind of look at what we should be looking at. And depending on what the deal is, we may have some support from them. But sometimes you also get into access and who are the advisors? Are you bringing those business conversations? We learned a lot of the best practices and approaches from our internal teams, but then also kind of go from there. If that makes sense.
Great. Take another question here in DC. You in the back.
Excuse me, Chris Crooks from Cressa. I have a question: whether does the real estate group get involved in the cultural integration when you're either the acquiree or in a merger? I'm assuming there's probably two different answers to this question, but do you look at do you get involved in the integration from a cultural standpoint? If so, how does it affect the real estate costs? For example, if the acquiree has a closed office environment, and do you try to keep them in that environment? Or you're open and try to mirror it, and do you account for those costs?
So as I understand the question, it's really around how does real estate help drive the culture through the M&A process?
I would say absolutely. I think real estate, again, we're agents of change, and so we're integral in that process. We absolutely are looking at exactly what's built in every place, trying to understand the business rhythms around that place, what they do, and then trying to drive a real estate solution that supports that business. And where you're putting them together, that's where the rubber meets the road. And everybody talked about networks and things like that, but and again, in the end, it's people, and you've got to find a way to sort of make them one business, and part of that is space to sort of create that. I think Tori mentioned the opportunity to sort of use some M&A dollars to sort of improve that environment for the host, and I think that's a great way to sort of drive that process forward.
Troy or Kevin, did you want to take a stab at that question?
One of the prime questions around the integration is, what is the integration plan for the business, right? You do acquisitions where the plan is to keep them very separate because it's a unique business, a unique culture, and you don't want to kind of bring them all together early in the process. In other cases, the synergies of the deal is around you have similar groups of similar skills that you want to get them together as quickly as possible. You want to see or the development cultures to kind of get together quicker, and that starts to very much impact culture of what are you trying to drive, and it's very much a conversation with HR and the business of what are the goals, what's really driving value in the deal, and how does that impact your integration plan.
Troy, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to one of the comments I made around, reading the message that goes out from the CEO. Most of the ones that I've seen is one CEO talking to the other CEO saying how aligned our cultures are. And, culture is very strong within our company, and the CEO puts an awful lot of effort into, a Pfizer voice that we have, which goes out every year, asked about 50 questions, and they kind of analyse that every way you can. So culture is quite a big part of what we do, and it's driven from the top, and quite often we find that other companies' cultures are going that way, and that there's quite good alignment. But you have to be respectful to people. You have to take them on that journey. Workplace can help to kind of align those cultures, as kind of Stephen and Kevin were touching on as well.
Great. I'm told I have time for one more question.
Rob Colson, just curious about your interaction pre-merger versus post-merger in terms of your interaction with the CIO shops that you deal with.
The CIO shop?
CIO.
Okay, so the question was around what is really the difference in the relationship with the CIO pre-merger or during the merger and post-merger?
Integration. Right.
So I think it's the same relationship we've got with most of the C-suite. It's at 100,000 feet, and you're talking about synergies and opportunities and networks and things like that. as you start to drill down into facility by facility, you learn lots of things about the network connection from the customer that you didn't know. You have to. For me, it's all about that scale and understanding where you fit and how you contribute within that scale in order to get the job done. And the CIO, no different than real estate, is fitting into that same model. And they've got boots on the ground that are trying to solve that network connection, as well as figuring out how you're going to merge the two email systems together. And it's a matter of scale, I think.
Kevin or Troy?
Yeah, so for us, the process, the framework that kind of walked through was really all pre-announcement, pre-signing of the contract, and we have pretty tight integrations with our IT group because we're trying to sort out what are those synergies, what are those timelines, what are those plans, even before we get to the announcement phase. And then clearly, as everyone gets into more of the details, those great thoughts and those great plans tend sometimes change, and that's clearly where there's that really, we find it incredibly important to stick together with that technology infrastructure group going up to the CIO and what the plan is.
Troy, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I guess slightly different tack here, but I guess the thing for me is once that deal's announced, the CEO's kind of moved on. So he's just thinking it's already been done. So he's not sitting around waiting for you to close those offices or do whatever fun stuff you're going to do. He's kind of looking for the next deal. He's already 2-3 years down the road. So going back to the CEO and sort of saying, "Oh, we've done a great job there," he's forgotten about it probably. So it's kind of current, but it's not current. So just remember where his head may be at.
That's great. Well, first, I want to thank all the panelists. So as we close, I just want to also introduce Cheryl Edelson, who is Senior Real Estate Manager for Lockheed. Hope you were taking notes, because on Tuesday, Lockheed announced that their IT and Global Solutions Group is being merged with Leidos in a $5 billion deal. So, Cheryl, hope you're taking notes. And this was an event that took many months to plan. So, again, special thanks to Kevin, Troy, and Steve, and Cheryl for all your planning. This was, I hope everyone agrees, an exciting discussion and topic. We hope you will continue the discussion on the Mid-Atlantic LinkedIn page if you so desire. But Cheryl, why don't you close us out?
Okay, well, that was a fantastic presentation. I really want to thank, again, the moderator, panelists. We had an A-team today, and it felt like we were all in one room. Peter and Steve and Troy and Kevin, thank you for bringing it all together and all the planning that went into it. I did take a lot of notes. I'm loaded with real estate strategies for the merger with Leidos, and I'm really anxious to get started on the transition planning, and I can see where we are in the phasing and the framework. It was really timely. This merger comes on the heels of another merger Lockheed had last quarter, and that was the purchase of Sikorsky Helicopter, and that was a $9 billion deal with 14,000 people and 7 million square feet added to the portfolio. So business is dynamic for all of us. I know here in the executive committee, 4 out of 5 of us, the Marriott Starwood Hotels, AOL, Verizon, and then we have with Peter the CBRE Johnson Controls. So it's happening everywhere, and this couldn't be more timely. And so as we've heard today, I think M&As call forth our core competencies of our profession. And it's gone from other duties as assigned to really being a career-defining event because of the significance and the high profile of it. So this kind of training and education, I think, is really important. And as CoreNet advocates, we've talked about it at a chapter level about increasing our advocacy of the profession. These are the stories that we can take to CFOs and CEOs and really talk up the value that we bring to the organizations. So to bring us to a close, I mean, hosting a forum across continents was really a first for the Mid-Atlantic chapter, and I think we hit a home run. And it's brought together professionals for the wealth of information. It was great working with the CoreNet chapter of New York and London, and I really want to give special thanks to Sheena Gohill in New York, the Managing Director of Colliers International, and then Robin Harris from Business Development Director of CBRE in London. Really worked the details to make this run flawlessly. Great partnership. And working on our behalf behind the scenes were a host of AOL people, technicians, and really made this work. Using one platform was fabulous to be able to transmit this program. And all the staff in each location were eager to see our success, and really their attention to detail was beyond my expectations. So thank you, Al, very much for hosting us. Thank you. And lastly, thanks to our audience across continents. Let's keep the conversation going. We have Twitter, we have LinkedIn, and we have a real opportunity here, I think, to continue and discuss more for all that's happening with each of us. So we have some time, more time for networking in each of the locations. But thank you. This concludes the transmission to New York and London. We'll see you hopefully again soon. Thank you.